Jeremy Fiser, senior member of Baird software investment banking team with a focus on the GovTech sector. Pleased to continue our GovTech interview series, and I'm pleased to be joined by Tom Nieto from PayIt. Tom is the president of PayIt and is going to walk us through an update on the business as well as just some overall thematics that play in and around the PayIt ecosystem. So with that, Tom, maybe I'll just ask you very briefly, but introduce yourself and a little introduction on PayIt.
Thank you, Jeremy. Really great to be with you today. So joined PayIt about a year and a half ago now from another GovTech company called Acela, and have really spent the better part of the last, call it 20 years around government technology, both within the actual GovTech space, but also at companies like Box, who did a bunch of work with a lot of federal, NASA, DoD, people like that. And so really, a lot of what drew me into the PayIt side was the company's vision and mission, which always resonates with me, of how are we going to continue to improve the technology that constituents use, but also how do we push that forward across the board to make sure that the friction gets reduced over and over, and how do you continue to evolve that approach?
Yeah, great. Talk about the PayIt solution offering today, and the solutions that you're providing, and maybe more importantly, what are the pain points that you're addressing at the state and local government level?
Really appreciate the question. I think the biggest pain point we hear over and over again is lack of adoption. And so a lot of what we see is that the experience that a constituent has as they're trying to interact with their government can be really painful. So oftentimes they have a hard time finding the service they're trying to interact with. Even if they can find it, actually completing a transaction can be really painful. So a lot of what we're trying to do is take that pain out and reduce the friction. And so as we think about it, we really try to be the transaction layer, empower each transaction. So across whether it be property tax, utilities, courts and justice, there can be a pretty full spectrum of where those transaction lies across your different departments in government. And we really try to power that across it so that you have a consistent experience across those different agencies, but also that we know you. So as you come in, if you've already paid your property tax with us, coming in to pay your utility bill or coming in to pay a parking ticket, is we remove a lot of that friction because we already know you and can actually reduce the amount of time and effort it takes in order to complete that transaction.
Yeah. It might be natural to think of PayIt as being heavy payments focused, maybe because the word pay is in the name, but you guys have positioned yourself as being much more in terms of driving modern customer experience for government. Why is it that the local government has garnered the reputation that it has for candidly lousy customer service? And how is it that PayIt is really trying to change that dynamic for local governments across the country?
Yeah, I think we have some benefits in that, we were born really cloud native and really with a constituent experience approach. And so what that means is instead of us designing the software and our transaction layer from a government agency perspective and how their process works, we were really designed from how does a constituent experience the software and how do they complete their transaction. And so it's a really flipping the traditional model on its head, so that it's really thinking about it from how does that flow work? So how do I find you? How do I show up? How do I make it as seamless as possible so that I can get in and get out as fast as possible? Roughly 80% of traffic for government websites result in some sort of transaction. And so most people are showing up in order to complete something. And so we really want to make that flow as seamless and frictionless as possible, which is very different from hey, here's the process and the backend system that agency uses, and how do then we extend that out to the constituent. We really start with the constituent first and work our way backwards from there.
Got it. Every poll that you see anymore coming out of CIOs is that one of their top, if not the top priority for them, is cybersecurity. I got to think with where PayIt sits within an ecosystem, particularly around payments, cybersecurity is a big part of kind of top of mind for you all. I mean, maybe just comment on the pressing need that cybersecurity has, kind of why is it such a pressing need for local CIOs, and what people like PayIt are trying to do to address that need.
Yeah, it's I think it's one of the things that we probably hear almost every single meeting we have with either a client or a prospect, and it's really around they take the the stewardship of their data and the information of their constituents so to heart that it extends to us and how we think about it. And so I think the challenge that they're facing is that, especially from an attack perspective, the attacks are getting more and more sophisticated. So you're seeing both an increase in volume and an increase in sophistication. And so I think a lot of what the onus is and where we try to provide value to our clients is actually trying to take away as much of that onus as possible. So whether that be fraud detection, whether that be increasing encryption, whether that be real-time anomaly monitoring, all those things we try to pull off their plate, knowing that they're not always going to have the experts in all those different pieces. And so the more that we can take that onus away from them and put it back on us, it's places, we invest consistently over and over again. And it's also part of our DNA. I think, again, being built the way we are and constructed that was part of how we thought about the architecture of the software from the beginning. And so we were fortunate enough that we didn't have a legacy, on-prem kind of situation where you had to then morph that into a cloud specific architecture. Ours was really built in the cloud and thinking about security and compliance as kind of the first line of defense across all this. And so helping to shield sensitive data from those backend systems is a part of where I think we add a lot of value for our clients and we've even had this recently with one of our clients where if the backend system gets broached, because we hold a lot of the sensitive data on our side, and there's a gap between the two of us, that you can even have a system of record have an issue, but it doesn't extend into us, and so we can actually keep their PCI PI data whole and without actually having to hit that backend system where there can be issues.
Yeah. How does that value prop around cyber differ, in your opinion, based on size of municipality? So is it more important for the smaller municipalities, or are you still seeing the same focus as you go up market to the tier ones and tier twos?
I think even sometimes the tier ones and tier twos it even increases because the attack area and the ability for, I guess, if you put yourself in the mind of someone who might be trying to breach a system, right? They're looking for, hey, where can I go find the most amount of dollars for my effort, right? And so oftentimes the larger
Yeah.
jurisdictions will be the biggest targets, and so you'll see the most sophisticated attacks often happen there because that's really where they're trying to focus in on. So what we think about from that is how do you put in as many of those protections up front so that you're able to monitor it and see it before anyone would ever kind of hit the actual sensitive data.
Got it. One of the big things that PayIt's been talking about is resident awareness. Maybe define how you guys think of resident awareness and what you guys are doing to try to, for your customers, drive overall resident awareness.
Yeah, we really think about it as constituent adoption. So if you think about traditionally, people are either mailing in, they're calling in, they're walking into their to do a transaction, and so we try to channel shift that into digital channels, which generally are both a better experience for the constituent, but then also a better experience for our government clients because having to get a mail-in check and then process that, or having to pick up a phone call, those tend to be both high friction transactions, but also high cost transactions for departments as well. And so trying to move that away from those, much more, friction-full models to the frictionless models is really where we try to focus in. And so a lot of what we focus with our partners is how do we actually drive that channel shift? So actually get them to find the right service in a meaningful way and then be able to make that transaction without needing to have a human interaction. So, in some places, we're at 97, 98% of the transactions go through without any sort of intervention from a department versus, when they start, oftentimes it's 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3 transactions are needing some level of physical engagement with the constituent. And so it's a really shifting that model on its head.
Talk about then, that's an interesting data point on that resident awareness uplift. How much of a driver of resident awareness uplift did COVID create? Just because you talk about the person that goes in to pay their utility bill in person, kind of do their permitting in person, you do all these things in person, and there was a period of time where obviously they couldn't. What have you guys seen just in terms of overall resident awareness of local government digital related solutions that they as residents can access in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes out of that was what I'll call, the ease of use. So if you think about, historically, and having had this conversation with several CIOs, is there was a big belief that people actually wanted to come in and physically interact with those. And so, I think there's a big mindset shift around what the desire is from the constituent, just because there was no way to physically come in and have that interaction. I would say the other, big part of that is there are certain demographics which just from a comfort level just weren't comfortable actually doing a digital transaction, whether that be not having access to the right ability to do it, or it was just uncomfortable for them because either they were underbanked or stuff like that. And so I think a lot of those walls have really got broken down through COVID. And so you're seeing that even in the demographics where historically you saw low digital adoption, you're seeing that there's a very different comfort level these days. And so across the demographics, you're seeing much more consistent usage, even in places that weren't there pre-COVID.
Yeah. We've talked about this in the past, just where we are on the adoption curve in terms of local gov, just overall adoption of digital solutions. And no one will argue if you compare it to the corporate world that our government apparatus is meaningfully behind in terms of digital adoption. You're a year and a half in at PayIt. What have you observed now in terms of and maybe how has that revised your view on where the local government apparatus is in terms of digital adoption, and maybe how far behind are we still?
I think if I think about it in sort of the baseball analogy, we're probably in the middle innings, mostly from a embracing of the model. I think the biggest thing that I've seen probably over the past 2 years is really the mindset shift of it no longer is, hey, I'm on the cutting edge with some of this. It's more of a, I have to do this. And so if you think about across the spectrum, between constituents, agency officials, elected officials, IT, I would say roughly across the board, they all would now agree that all this should be able to be done digitally and be done in a frictionless environment. Whereas if you rewound the tape 2 or 3 years ago, there were still several pockets within that were in disagreement on should we be moving in this direction. And so I think everybody now wants to move that direction. And so part of the catching up to the rest of the private sector is how do you move in a more meaningful pace, knowing that there's a lot of red tape at the end of the day between budget cycles, election cycles that they have to go through and contend with. And so those things have to move at a pretty measured pace. But we're seeing a ton of, especially agency officials who are getting asked from their constituents, hey, we want to be able to do this. And so they're now having to react and actually want to react and provide them with a better experience.
Yeah, one of the things we anecdotally talk about is this a sea change in terms of CIOs across the country. We got an older generation of CIOs retiring and a newer generation coming in there more cloud comfortable, if you will. Maybe talk about, are you guys seeing or kind of feeling that same dynamic when you're evangelizing or going out and talk about the benefits of using a cloud first solution?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge part of the tailwinds that we're seeing is the IT side of it. I think it's also mirrored on the agency side where historically you had some agency directors who came up through the ranks, whether that be, hey, I was a building inspector before or I was a tax collector, and you're seeing more people with some of the private sector experience. And so they're thinking about their world in a different way. And almost to the degree where we have several clients who are thinking about, hey, we would have to do a tax increase, but because of the way that we're able to help facilitate their cash flow now, they're able to avoid 10% plus tax increases in some areas because of the way that they're actually able to generate the cash flow and then the investment off of it. So they're thinking about it with a little bit more of a private sector kind of lens to it versus historically how we saw it approach, which was, hey, here's how we did it before, and we're just going to continue that process over and over again. They're starting to really shift that mindset, both on the IT and the agency side.
Yep. Yep. Interesting. Last question, maybe a fun question. Maybe give us a sense of favorite song in the moment.
Yeah, well, with 2 younger sons, I don't always get to control the radio, but I think when I do, I tend back to my jazz roots and really love Charles Mingus and especially Open Letter to Duke if you're a jazz fan at all, Jeremy.
Wow, that's a unique pick. I like it. Tom, thanks a lot for joining us. This has been a helpful update, both just kind of thematically across what you're seeing in GovTech, but as well as for PayIt specifically. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Jeremy.